Well, thank you once again for joining us as we go through the book, What If Jesus Was Serious About Prayer by Skye Jethani. And we are actually starting part 3 of the book. This is video 7, but we're starting part 3 of the book. And we're just going to briefly kind of go over those first 3 chapters of part 3, which are 17. Then the line between God's work and ours will disappear, 18. Then we will have the dignity of being causes, and then 19. Then how do our prayers change God's action? So yeah, beginning of part 3, we're looking at John 15, verses 1 to 11. This is where Jesus is in the upper room interacting with his disciples right before he's going to get arrested and crucified, and he's encouraging them to abide in him. And essentially the importance of what it means to abide in him there. So
yeah, and that's one of my favorite portions of John in this part. The metaphor of the vine and the branches is we've talked quite a bit about it in recent months, just the whole abiding idea, and now we're kind of looking at it in the perspective of prayer. And it was interesting to talk about the difference between a prayer life and a praying life. And I know that we talked about that last time, and I'm certainly more aware of the presence of God in my life and just trying to take those moments and being inclusive of God or Jesus in what I'm doing in real time.
Yeah, and that's just it. I think it's just more context to what we were saying with the praying life. You know, it's blurring the lines, you know, from the our thing, God things, whatever, like categories, what we talked about last time, you know, in Skye kind of labels, kind of talks about eliminating those labels and categories. And, you know, he brings up the difference between eliminating categories like sacred and secular, ministry and vocation, clergy and laity. And and it's really much more about, you know, the idea of God is present, and when we blur those lines, we start to be able to recognize his presence, and just growing in the ability to recognize his presence.
Yeah, I like this idea a lot because we're so used to thinking about prayer in terms of including God in what I do, but we don't always think about God including us in what he's doing.
Yeah,
and there's where the line becomes the fuzzy line they're talking about there. And because we we really like to compartmentalize things.
Well, and truthfully, sometimes let's face it, those things can overlap when we're doing kind of our thing, and then God's doing something else kind of in the midst of that. And, you know, and it's so much like, I kind of liken it to, like, you know, we're, you know, we don't need to keep a log so we know who to bill, you know, that everything is happening together.
Yep.
You know, and that's, you know, it's just it's blurring these lines.
I think that's another tendency we have as humans is we like to have categories so we can have checkbox, right? I got this done, I got that done, I got that done. Where the more we include God in our life and God's including us in his mission, the two overlap so much that they become the same thing.
That's right. Yeah, and I think as we go on, like what's really, I think, amazing is that God does want us to join in. Mm-hmm. You know, and I love Skye's quote in chapter 18, I believe, where he says, throughout the biblical narrative, we see examples of the Lord involving humans in activities he could easily and more effectively accomplish alone.
That is a mystery, isn't it? Why does he choose to use us?
Why does he do that? Oh, absolutely. Well, I mean, he wants us to participate. I think I know for me, it's definitely, I see the idea of just, it gives us dignity and even a little bit of ownership. Because I mean, truthfully, like he could treat us like, you know, like the little kid who wants to play like the Switch with the older kids, and the older kids to sort of stop the little kid from whining or appease, you know, your parents. You give them the controller that's not actually connected, and they're playing, but like nothing's happening, but they don't really know that. They're like, they feel included, but they're not really playing at all, you know, and it's the whole John 15 is really like, it's about being connected. I mean, that's literally what the passage is about. And the result of being a active participant, not a passive prop, and, not just sort of to like feel good, help their feelings until you figure out that the controller was never connected.
Never connected.
And you're really not that. You weren't controlling Mario or whatever you're.
Yeah. When we were discussing this in our group, the idea came up that it's like a parent that does something like a project like making cookies with your child. It's not that that's the most efficient way to make cookies. It's it's involving your child in the process of making them. They're actually learning how to make cookies, and you're spending time together.
That's right. And it's probably far more messy.
Yeah, absolutely.
Which
and more cleanup.
Which we could probably, so many illustrations come out of that sort of like when we join in with God, it tends to maybe be a little bit more messy.
Yep, and that's because we're messing it up most of the time.
Yeah, boy, most of the time. Yeah.
All the time, yes.
Well, as we move along, I really I'll see it even in particular challenged by chapter 19, and how do our prayers change God's action when we think that, the fact that he's all knowing and all powerful and all that, like, but what about how do our prayers change the actions of the all knowing, all powerful God? And I do think we can kind of get trapped and all turned around in kind of this philosophical debate of how this might work.
Yeah, I think sometimes we get caught up with the idea that unless we pray in the right frame of mind or in the right, we have to make sure there's no sin in our life, or there's a specific method to prayer, which we've discussed already in previous videos. Those things are just not true. But we can also get caught up in ideas that just, that God, it really doesn't matter what we pray or how we pray or even if we pray, because God's going to take care of it anyway. So why bother?
Yeah, and I think, I really like how Skye brought up, and I think it's just something we always need to keep in mind when reading the Bible, that, it was written by ancient authors that didn't necessarily look at or were concerned with the same things we were concerned with.
Yeah, absolutely.
And so, like the idea of the difference between, okay, if God is sovereign, how do our prayers, change his action? Because if he knows all, like, this could be like that. But they're not necessarily having, we have the category, I guess, either or.
Yep.
And they seem to be really comfortable with both end.
Yep.
Just like, and even the tension it might bring, like, for whatever reason, they're not concerned with that. And so it's not really, I think we're asking things that they're not necessarily answering and
caring about. Yeah. And I think I appreciate Skye's honesty in saying that he doesn't know how it works, but he knows it does. And God invites us to work with him.
Well, and just to think, like, I mean, it's so easy, and I'm sure I know people have done it when, like, we're just that difficulty of like, this is a little tougher. We kind of just sort of what can we say to sort of, I don't know, make it up so we sound like we know what we're talking about, as opposed to saying, yeah, I don't really know how it works. Yeah, there's a mysterious element to this that's just beyond, at least he says, beyond his understanding, and definitely beyond my understanding.
Yeah, absolutely. But sometimes we just have to be okay with the tension of mystery.
Absolutely. And I think it's sort of like going into, I think, what I would see when I'm especially reading these 3 chapters, but even this right here, that even though he's sovereign, and we know that, but he does say many times is mentioned many times throughout the Bible, he does want to know our requests. Mm-hmm. And I think we've talked about it so many times where it's the idea of even though he knows us because he knows all, he still wants that dignity to see us to eye, face to face, kind of that. And I think really the idea is dignity is such a huge part, in God's desire to be connected, to be integrated in all categories of our lives, that we actually get to play an active part in the story that he wants us to, and that ultimately our voice does matter.
Yeah. I agree with all of those things. It's just our voice does matter to God.
It does.
So
matter.
Thanks again for joining us this week as we're working through these chapters, and hopefully you found it helpful or beneficial. And I know one thing that really helps me is to discuss it with somebody. And so there's some link to some questions in the show notes today, and hopefully you can look up those questions, and they're great for personal review. But again, getting other people's perspectives, lots of times will bring up things that maybe you didn't think of. So hopefully you'll take some time to do that with a trusted friend, or if you're part of our church community, with your missional community. So thanks again for joining us, and I hope you'll join us again for our next video.